Hi, I'm Murray Collins, and this is the Nature-Based Solutions podcast. I have the great pleasure of being in the room this morning with Geoffrey Seeto, Senior Managing Director at New Forest. Geoffrey, good morning.
Thank you, Murray. Pleasure to be here. Good morning.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
And we are in this fantastic podcasting studio in Singapore. Wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's very nice, actually.
Well, thanks very much for taking the time. We wanted to have a bit of a think this week about the strategic side of nature-based solutions.
Yep.
Have a bit of a focus on how a nature asset manager evaluates and invests into forestry projects, particularly with a focus on emerging markets, and explore what makes a forest project investable, going right through from species selection, landscape potential to carbon integrity and community value. So would I be able to hand over to you, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about New Forests?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I'm responsible for the emerging markets for New Forest, so head of emerging markets. What that means in the real sense is that we have strategies in Africa under our African Forest Impact Platform, which was raised in 2023. And that is a fund that's responsible for broad-based forestry investment in sub-Saharan Africa. And closer to home, of course, we're in Singapore. So we have a Singapore office that runs our Southeast Asian business, and I am based here. And that is our Tropical Asia Forest Fund 2, as well as a more recently raised fund called the Future Forest Innovation Fund. And that is, at the moment, a single managed account by a single Japanese corporate investor.
Okay. That sounds brilliant. And can you tell us a bit more about New Forest?
Yeah,
I'm thinking there will be people watching, despite the size and the name of the organisation, but there will be people watching who don't know so much about New Forest. Could you say at a high level,
so for those
the way you're structured, what you do?
Absolutely. So for those of you who don't know about New Forest, we're one of the largest forestry and nature-based asset managers in the world. We have 4 strategies and were started in 2005. So the strategies are basically geographically defined. And so we have our main office in Australia, New Zealand. We have a strategy in North America based in San Francisco. I run, of course, the Southeast Asian business, as well as been responsible for our African business. So 4 main geographies at this time. We're also managing around probably about just over $8 billion US under management, and a total area of about 4.3 million hectares. And that is, for comparison purpose, about the size of Denmark.
It's quite a large area.
Right.
People, you normally say the size of Wales. So it's good to hear Denmark getting a shout. So you've got this focus yourself in Southeast Asia.
Yes.
But it sounds like you actually spend most of your time in airports at the moment, going from event to event. But Southeast Asia, at least from my perspective, I spend a lot of time here. Seems to be an enormous amount of activity in forestry. But you've got this global view. Where do you see is the sort of epicenter for forestry activity at the moment?
Well, I mean, the traditional forestry markets are more in the developed markets. So the biggest forestry market for investable, sustainable plantations is obviously the US. Australia is also quite a large market. Where we see the likes and the opportunity in Asia, for instance, is around the thematics around incremental wood usage. So what we have found, or one of the mega trends that we've based our Asian forestry business and started that business in 2008, is around GDP per capita and the world's middle class. So by 2050, there'll be at least 60 to 80% of the world's middle class in Asia. That's defined by GDP per capita. And there is a direct correlation between wood usage and GDP per capita. So we think most of the incremental demand for wood usage, sustainable wood usage, is going to come from the Asian countries. Indonesia, China, and India are the 3 most populous countries, in the 3 of the 4 most populous countries in the world. And in order to meet that demand, the development of industrial tree plantations and sustainable forestry in Asia, being proximate to their end users, is certainly one of those themes. Some of the other themes include the ability to access land. Of course, in developed markets, it's much harder to access land, but also the ability to effect nature-based solutions. So that's a real tailwind in our market now, manifested by carbon in the first instance, but also we think about forestry plantations and landscapes in terms of nature. So all the ecosystem services that you get from that. First carbon, next biodiversity, water purification and usage, and other types of ecosystem benefits. And we're trying to make sure that the land that we invest into is valued for not just the forestry component, but all these different things.
Okay, and that's a super interesting point. Yep. So legacy or historically, it's really the US market, Australia,
and Europe.
In Europe, but I suppose, from my own world, I'm thinking more about like nature-based solutions and forestry, and Asia is really where it's at for the future then. So building forwards for 2050, having the supply near to the sources of the demand.
Yeah, and that's a primary reason we also went into Africa. So we'll call them emerging markets, and Latin America is is obviously of great interest to us as well.
Okay, and then so you picked up on some really interesting points there. Difference between forestry as such and nature-based solutions being a tailwind, in particular for what's going on here in Southeast Asia. Can we dig into that a little bit? So. I would say, and we mentioned it as we came into the studio, the idea that there's a dichotomy, there's a choice between having conservation, restoration, and maybe a sustainable forest management is also something else. But you seem to see things in a much more holistic manner.
Absolutely. And I think I was in a conference last week and they asked us to myth bust. Okay. I don't know if you've seen that show, Mythbusters,
I've seen the show.
TV.
I love it. Yeah.
So they said, what is one of the greatest myths around forestry investment and nature-based solutions? And I think one of the greatest myths is the generation of positive impact outcomes, or sustainability in general, is not mutually exclusive to making a return for your investors in a forestry plantation. And the way we think about that is, around, if you look at our second forestry fund in Asia, TAF2, we'll call it Tropical Asia Forest Fund 2, that's a blended finance structure. And the whole idea around that blended finance structure is to allow us to do more good with intentionality, so generate positive impact outcomes, while still being able to have a financial return for the commercial investors into the fund. And those positive impact outcomes are around the generation of climate change mitigation, biodiversity conservation and preservation, and community outcomes, so impact on livelihoods, as well as positive community outreach programs.
And so things like, say, drill into biodiversity. How do you, in practice, measure biodiversity? Is that are you thinking about the species that are used in the forestry context, so what you plant, or do you think about the broader context, so things like insects, mammals, birds?
So it's the broader context with insects, mammals, birds, and other types of biodiversity. And so even with our projects now, we take biodiversity baselines.
Okay.
And so with carbon projects, you have what they call co-benefits. So there's a biodiversity element in that. Maybe I can explain the mixed landscape approach that we use.
Okay, sure.
And then it'll become a lot clearer in terms of how we think about landscape. So if you think about a forestry concession, so there's an area of land. Within that landscape, there'll be an element of the industrial tree plantation that's sustainably grown. There'll be elements of high conservation value forestry for conservation and preservation. There'll be biodiversity elements that include animals, mammals, insects, and other types of species, combined with those natural areas. There'll be riparian boundaries. There'll be areas where they're inundated and you can't use, and there'll be areas of community, of course. So, within that whole landscape, we're looking to optimize all that land in terms of being able to then manage it properly. And of course, there's potential processing too. So in Asia, we look at a vertically integrated supply chain amongst all our assets. And all this can be embedded into one single landscape. And with that, you can have carbon projects, you can have biodiversity projects. We build biodiversity corridors, and there's an industrial tree plantation on the back of that.
Okay, fantastic. And is there anywhere in particular where you could give us some examples of where you're doing things like creating biodiversity corridors? I mean, I've had the pleasure of traveling quite a lot in Southeast Asia, and seeing quite a lot of different forests. Curious if there's any particular country.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a property in West Kalimantan. So, the island of Borneo is one of the most biodiversity-rich areas in the world. And in that we have a plantation, but the gross area is 100,000 hectares, right? We've planted about 20,000 of that with trees, but more importantly, there's about 42,000 hectares of high conservation value forestry that we've set aside to be conserved. So there's the area
double the amount of the plantation is set aside
of the planted.
Has that ever been logged?
It's never been logged, and so it's high conservation value forestry under the FSC guidelines.
Wow! And
so we're very proud of that. But that wasn't enough. So what we did was,
have you actually been hiked in the forest?
I have,
really?
And it's almost across from just some of the planted areas that we have.
Yeah.
And so in order to achieve additional impact, we work with Partnerships for Forests out of the UK to do a landscape level project with our neighbouring palm oil plantations and other types of tree plantations to build a biodiversity corridor so that sun bears and the orangutans can get to the national park areas.
Have you seen either of those species?
We've seen sun bears.
Yeah.
We've seen orangutan nests.
Okay.
But we haven't seen any orangutans.
I mean, the wild ones are pretty elusive,
yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. But that is an example of that mixed-use landscape. We are now looking at building out processing as well in that area. But that is a great example of being able to provide livelihoods through employment, working with local communities to be able to plant trees and help them on their land, but also bringing that capacity building element into our own plantations as well.
Okay, that's fantastic. And how do the local community respond to having that large area of forest set aside as high conservation value? Is there a sort of a demand for going in and taking out non-timber forest products, that kind of thing? And
so we do allow our local communities to go in and amongst our forest, obviously, for their livelihoods. But they welcome that because they rely on that area, some of those areas. And in some cases, it's not just about planting doing a cash crop, but for subsistence.
Yeah.
So that's very important because one of the things that drive a lot of the local communities, they have maybe 1 or 2 hectares. 1 hectare is planted for food and subsistence, and the other they've used for commercial ventures. So it works out really well, and they obviously get to conserve the forest as well, which is good for them.
Brilliant. I was just slightly further north. I was in Sarawak
yes.
last week in Kuching. So saw some of this region from the aircraft, and of course look at a lot of it from space, and you can see the extent to which it's changed over the past few decades.
Yeah.
But it's great to hear that you're integrating those very large areas of set aside into the plantations that you create. So I'm curious then, if you think about something like North America versus the context of operating in West Kalimantan, those are very, very different markets and very, very different ecosystems. What are the major things from your perspective? How do you frame those? What are the differences?
Yeah, so I mean, we're still growing the same product, and there is still a requirement for setting aside high conservation value forest areas. Our North American plantations or our Australian plantations are still FSC certified.
Right.
I think the main difference around those developed areas are a number of things. One is in North America and Australia, you get to own the land.
Right.
In most parts of the emerging markets, it's more around a concession base, so land use entitlement or a lease.
So you might have a lease in Kalimantan for 60 years or something.
Or 100 years. So it's much like infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the fundamental differences between that. The other part is the areas in more developed markets, the forestry ecosystem, including processing, transportation, end user markets are much more developed. So you can be a pure forestry grower for timber and there'll be a timber mill down the road. So one of the things we want to do is integrate more of that in terms of vertical integration because there's not a lot of processing in and amongst where our plantations are. So that vertical integration not only helps with the ability to generate jobs and positive community outcomes, but it also adds value to the local economy because you're processing more onshore and you're not.
Well, presumably then
exporting
the government is very much in favour of you doing this, right?
Yes.
Because you're not just exporting a raw product, you're adding value
Correct.
within Indonesia in this case.
Correct. And Laos is a great example of that.
Right.
So the government of Laos is one of the shareholders in our forests.
Okay.
They see us as part of the solution to reforest 70% of Laos land area by a certain period of in a certain period of time. So they see us as one of the good guys that do what we say. So that aligns us not with just with governments, but local and provincial communities as well.
Yeah, because Laos has been pretty heavily deforested, hasn't it?
A lot of Asia has,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's interesting. And then, well, we've talked about the kind of assets that you're targeting. And the geographies, obviously, you're looking at Southeast Asia, but then any particular species? I mean, we were chatting outside about species and growth rates and so
Yes.
on. How do you think about species selection? Are you always targeting growth rates, or is it like trying to keep on top of what the demand is in the market? You've mentioned this astonishing figure that 60 to 80% of the world's wealth is really pivoting to being in Asia by 2050.
Yes.
Are you forecasting demand for any particular types of wood as a part of that process?
Yeah. So we are around the tropical band. So this sort of latitude and longitude. I always get them too confused, whichever the one that goes around the latitude. So they're mainly tropical species.
Yep.
And so the two most dominant plantation species are eucalypts and acacia. And in certain areas, we'll look at some of the local species, like in Indonesia, there's jabon and malina and some of those other types of species. And so this is going to be a mouthful, but when we look at sites and we do the soil sampling, we have site-specific species selection.
Yep. Okay.
And so within eucalypts, for instance, there's hybrids and clones and a whole bunch of different types of species within that. So it's like, human beings, but you're from UK and I'm from Australia, for instance.
Yeah.
And so we plant whatever is the most prevalent or what we think would grow the best in terms of what we're trying to the outcomes that we're trying to get, whether that's form or fire resistance. But mainly it's eucalyptus and acacia with some local species thrown in. Where you get that diversity is you get the monoculture in the plantation, but if you think about the landscape, for instance, then you get a lot of natural areas.
Right.
And so when you look at it in totality, it is actually a mixed-use forest. It just happens this area is planted with plantations and that area has natural species in it.
Okay, so you wouldn't expect to go into one of your plantations expecting there to be diversity within that. It's on that broader landscape
level.
And
yes.
presumably as well, there's some limitations to what you can plant with respect to local capacity to have like nurseries and
That's
so on.
right. That's right. So, building up that local capacity, whether it's harvesting or planting, is something that helps the communities, but also, there's very limited supply in some cases.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Great. Well, you're clearly heavily personally invested in this and quite animated about what you're doing. I'm curious what excites you about this region the most, and where do you see the most impact?
Yeah, so I think when you're talking about emerging markets forestry, the availability of land, but also the ability to generate positive impact, and just the growing conditions. Trees typically grow faster with higher rainfall, and so you see incredible amounts of growth rates. And I think that's a very important point, because if you have an intensively managed tree plantation, then you're displacing. If there's demand for wood, you're displacing, natural forests in terms of deforestation, because you're supplying timber and lumber. And so that availability, being so close to your end user markets, is certainly a very exciting thing. And so what we want to do is not just have the same assets trading amongst ourselves, but also to put new trees on the ground and to do greenfields plantations. And because of the advent of carbon and other things, other types of ability to monetize ecosystem services in our landscapes, that is becoming a viable proposition now.
That's interesting.
So expanding the forestry space is obviously one of the highest priorities, and that's expanding the forestry space with our mission and vision aligned impact outcomes is certainly where some people would say we're at the coalface of that in emerging markets.
Well, let's dig into that one. So monetizing ecosystem services.
Absolutely.
My mind immediately goes to carbon, but then also I've heard a lot of people over the past couple of years talking about biodiversity credits. When you talk about monetizing ecosystem services, what do you mean specifically?
So specifically, we're talking about the plantation.
Yeah.
We're talking about carbon.
Yeah.
We are future-proofing our assets for biodiversity. So by taking baselines and investing in and looking at the different types of ways to measure that, but also the standards that are developing. Eventually down the road, there may be other things as well. So when you think about the community outreach and livelihoods, that is a social license to operate. So not only are we trying to monetize and increase the revenues from a piece of land, we're also managing the risk around that. And so mainly the biggest risks that you'll find in emerging markets is around land tenure and land use and communities.
Yeah.
So managing that gives us that social license, which is very, very important in a project.
I mean, we do a lot of work when entities are looking to invest into a project, or it might be a project developers looking for a new opportunity as well.
Yep.
We support with diligence. It tends to be the technical aspects of diligence, looking at carbon potential,
Absolutely.
carbon stocks and so on. But the one thing
and you do a very good job at it, by the way.
Thank you very much. But one thing which always comes up and seems to be a repeated theme is land tenure.
Yep.
Like Latin America, Indonesia in particular, people are always concerned as like, okay, this area in principle is great to go and develop an asset, but there's a lot of uncertainty. So how do you tackle that tough nut?
Yeah, so with respect to land tenure, the concessions will be zoned for a certain land use, but more than that, when we're on site, we engage with the communities in and around those plantations. And so participatory mapping exercises, economic baselines for communities, so we can identify how we can generate and deal with, work with the most vulnerable communities first in terms of giving them a livelihood. But fundamental to that is this concept of FPIC, or free, prior and informed consent. And what we do is we go in first to make sure that the communities understand what our intentions are, what we want to use the land for, and how we're going to involve them. And with that full information, they can make a fully informed decision around consent for us to be able to do that. And so to give you a really great example, we just don't do it once. We are constantly doing, I call it continuous FPIC, but some people will call it continuous consultation. And so if you look at our assets in Laos, for instance, we have continuous FPIC. So all our assets have social and environmental teams embedded within management, and they go around to all the villages. And so the first instance was that we wanted to consult with the villagers and inform them and then gain their consent. When we first bought the asset, we separated the men and the women, and we spoke to them separately. And so I may get some flack for this, but women tend to make better financial decisions for the family and outcomes. Okay. And we didn't want any coercion.
Right.
As we're going along, if we want to do harvesting or planting or something in an area, we'll talk to those communities first, and they'll give us feedback. They don't want a particular type of pesticide or fertilizer or what have you, for instance. And we have our social teams are visiting on a weekly basis these communities.
And what are they doing in practice then? Is that like, have they got a standard survey which they fill in, or is it like open-ended
So we
questions?
have town hall meetings.
Okay.
We conduct town hall meetings, and if less than a good percentage of that village has to turn up, and half that meeting must be women. Yeah. Otherwise, we just come back another day. So it's just those little things that you learn on the ground to really engage communities, because once they have that sense of ownership and engagement, they will also commit to the decisions that you're making as well.
Well, I suppose in those contexts, then their local economy is pretty much entirely dominated by natural ecosystems and what happens with timber plantations and so on. That's why it's so important. That's why they would turn up to these meetings.
And so that is, especially in some of the more remote areas, they rely on those areas for their livelihoods. And I think with that free, prior and informed consent and that community engagement, then we talk to them about what we can do with their land and whether we can plant trees on their land so they can gain an income as well.
Opportunity.
As a new opportunity for them as well. So that engagement piece gives us that social license, but it's a much better risk management approach than it is to, ignore them and then have that conflict, because that's not part of the principles we invest under.
Okay, well, it seems to be like there's a huge opportunity to balance all of these different things. So sustainable forestry, conservation, commercial outcomes, including for people in rural locations who are thinking about what they might want to do with their
I wish it was as easy as it sounds.
Because it sounds great, and I've been to lots of these places, and I know that there's always tensions because different people want different things. The markets move. There's different price signals for planting different types of crops and so on. So here's one for you. How do you balance the commercial goals of forestry projects with the needs of the local communities, and this carbon first focus, which you see in the voluntary carbon market? There's all these different objectives. You've explained very clearly that what you're doing, you're trying to plant eucalypts and acacia, but in a broader, more biodiverse landscape. That makes lots of sense. Great examples from West Kalimantan of setting aside large areas of biodiverse forest. But you've also got the communities to take into consideration. How do you balance this? Do you use like a quantitative model? Is it a little bit of an art form?
Yeah. So when we buy assets as part of the diligence process, so it is quite quantitative, and so environmental and social impact assessments, participatory mapping of the community's use of those areas, understanding where they are. And if you can appreciate the landscape, it doesn't mean that they're all where the tree plantation is, and the tree plantation may not be contiguous, so it could be strung out along in and amongst that whole landscape. But involving them in the decision-making process, informing in the decision-making process. And we find not just with our partners, not just with provincial and state governments, and not just with communities, but that alignment piece, whether it be economic alignment or social alignment, is the single most important thing. And we spend an inordinate amount of our due diligence time trying to understand what the communities want, what governments want, what our local partners want. And I think that is much better than anything that you can do in terms of other types of analysis and trying to have contractual obligations and what have you. Because at the end of the day, that alignment piece is good for them as it is good for you. Yeah. And I think that's the most powerful and probably the best advice I can give anyone looking to invest or operate some of these project forests.
That's great advice. The local people,
absolutely,
that's the constituency that you have to engage with, right? Okay. Can we go a bit more specific, shift gears slightly here, and think about project selection? So I'm actually just wondering, does project selection make sense in the context that you've described of a landscape approach? But let's persist and see if it works. What makes a forestry project investor ready? And then how can project developers improve their attractiveness to asset managers?
Absolutely. So we take a partnership approach, and we have limited resources as a team. So we have a partnership approach. And so one of the things that we want to do when we invest into forestry assets is we like to have a local partner who understands the lay of the land. And the way things work. And with that, Asia or the most emerging markets is very much a bilateral market. And when I say that is in terms of investment and understanding where the investments are, it's a very relationship-driven market, dominated by very large corporates, strategics. So if you think of the two of the 5 largest pulp and paper producers, they are domiciled in Asia and primarily in Indonesia. A lot of the forestry growers and forestry timber companies are family-run companies or, traditionally family-run companies in Asia. So with that partnership and that bilateralness, it's not like I can, a fund selling assets and there's a, auction process and there's an investment bank that's involved. That may happen sometimes, but the market is not that developed here yet. So part of that is being able to then leverage off the partners, but also your own experience and relationships in the market. And now and what that does is gives us a bigger reach in order to maximize our limited resources. Now we know how to operate forestry, especially the biological element of it, but also managing that land for people and others. And we can then understand and apply our sustainable and impact investment metrics and systems to bear on those forestry assets. So primarily when we look at assets, they have to have some element of a tree plantation or the ability to generate carbon or both. And then we can work with the rest of that landscape using FSC certification, but also the IFC performance standards that we use. But that alignment piece is still very much prevalent. We spend a lot of time diligencing our partners to ensure that they are aligned, they think like we do, and they want to have the same purpose, vision, and mission that we have as an investor. And then we seek to improve those standards, whether that be governance, sustainability, or otherwise. So we want to control that asset.
And what would then be a red flag for you when you're diligencing a partner? What are the kind of things that you look out for?
So I don't want to go into too much in terms of red flags, but things of if they had deforestation in the past, for instance, and then certain areas, then we can't get FSC certification. That's certainly something that we wouldn't do. And then the background of the partner, for instance, if they're politically motivated or don't have the same sort of alignment that we do, then we tend not to invest with those sort of partners. And that's why partly our transactions take a little bit longer than you would in developed markets, because a lot of that time is spent diligencing the partner themselves to ensure alignment.
And this is the catchword of integrity, right?
Correct.
That's been the past couple of years. I think that's been the main focus of forestry market, voluntary carbon market, is how do you get high integrity projects. So I suspect it was going to be a lot of your previous answers you'll have to reuse here, but how do you balance then commercial viability with the social and ecological integrity of a project when you're working with local communities? Yeah,
so part of that is the diligence process to ensure integrity. As an example, 2 years ago, when we raised our second Tropical Asia Forestry Fund 2 with a carbon element, we published our demand and supply integrity policies around the generation of carbon. So standards help tremendously. So the latest standard in terms of the carbon markets is the ICVCM, or the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, and they accept certain methodologies and standards. So VERA, Gold Standard, American Carbon Registry, they apply a CCP label, which is a core carbon principle label. That is now seen as the highest standard in terms of in the market. So when we develop carbon projects, we develop them according to the ICVCM accepted standards and methodologies. New Forest itself has a zero tolerance for reputational risk, and we have our own sustainability and impact standards that we apply to the assets themselves. In some cases higher than the local standard, and even higher than potentially some of the FSC and IFC performance standards type standards. So it's a combination of assurance and compliance with the ability to then do more good. So we actually measure those impact outcomes and we report them. So for our investors, for instance, in Europe, if they're having under TNFD or increased transparency in terms of disclosures, and they have to disclose them, we are able to track 80 plus sustainable landscape investment metrics, and we put that on our own sustainability report. So we're moving towards a TNFD disclosure regime, but also they can port that directly onto their balance sheets. And in future, with that transparency, then consumers can make an informed decision about the institutions they bank with, the products that they buy, whether that's sustainably sourced or not sustainably sourced. And that transparency is driving a lot of that sustainability in the market. So we think that's a very good thing. And governments are continually coming to the fore and regulating for increased transparency around the nature risks on your balance sheet, not just the carbon risks on your balance sheet.
I know this shift from carbon to a narrative around nature has been quite a big one. I mean, do you have any reflections on why that is? What's driven that transition?
I think it's partly because people value land for more than just carbon. There was a great phrase once at a conference I went to, and I've sort of paraphrased it. But to value
it's
land,
good of you to admit it.
Yes, to value forest or land for just the carbon content is like valuing a car just for the tires it doesn't include the engine or the user experience and what have you. So that's the sort of the approach we take. And so when at New Forests, the holy grail for all of this is not carbon or timber or biodiversity; it's natural capital. And so that land or that forestry, that mixed-use landscape, as an asset on your balance sheet to offset the liabilities, and we're getting there, and that's the holy grail. But now we've gone from trees and timber to carbon. Biodiversity is next, and now we're talking about nature. And the next thing would be then having a piece of natural capital on your balance sheet, whether that's tokenized or what have you. That's
very interesting.
It is.
I don't know if we've got time to dig into this.
We've been advocating for nature since our outset, because we believe that land is not just any single piece of it, but it's the totality and the use of it.
Okay. And so you're then building up this big bank effectively of natural capital with baselines which show the impact that you've actually had on natural capital, and you see that as a valuable asset for the future.
Absolutely. So I'll give you an example. Even in the US, they grow trees around the dams to prevent erosion and siltation in the dams, because otherwise you'll have to dredge it out. So there is an ecosystem service, and the trees provide water retention and purification, obviously, and all those things are not valued yet. So ultimately, the valuation of all those will then give that land value, and enough value to compete against other land uses like deforestation for palm oil. And so it's that true value of the land that we need to understand and reflect.
Fantastic. It was great to hear that from an entity with $8 billion under management. What will it take then, given that and that mission and given that worldview, what will it take for nature and natural capital to be valued like that? Does it mean that the carbon markets have to really take off in concert with a biodiversity market, plus things like TNFD becoming mandatory? What's the recipe to make this all work?
It takes everything.
Everything.
Yeah,
okay.
no, absolutely.
All right.
So what we're starting to see is carbon is certainly the first manifestation of that.
Yeah.
And we need these markets to act like markets. And when we talk about carbon markets, and let's just use that for an example.
Yeah.
The more carbon markets act like financial markets, the more people are able to then invest with assurity and integrity. The more it acts like a stock or a bond. And you're seeing that develop. So we have the markets, they're financial markets. So you're seeing the ecosystem start to develop around carbon markets. You're seeing insurance companies that can insure deliverability or political risk. You're seeing ratings agencies pop up, and they're starting to rate carbon projects. You're seeing the ability to trade on, at least domestic markets around trading systems and regimes. We need market makers. We need all these things that the financial markets already have to be able to make this as homogeneous a product as we can, so that people can buy and sell and trade these with assurance. When you buy a share in a stock market, that's highly regulated, and you know what you're getting. You're getting a share and an ownership in a company. When you buy a carbon credit or a natural capital ownership in a forest, you should be able to have, with that assurance, that ability to then rely on regulation and the players in the industry to be able to have a high integrity carbon credit or natural capital asset.
Okay, and what would you say now there's power laws everywhere. What's the biggest single thing which is missing at the moment, if you could put your finger on it?
If I was to say the biggest single thing, I think the standards bodies have come a long way.
Yeah.
There's controversy, but that's like with any market. Banks fail, and we don't throw out the financial markets either.
Nope.
So we just have to improve and make it better. I think governments need to come to the party now. And I say that understanding that there are compliance regimes. So we operate in North America, we operate in Australia and New Zealand, where they're all compliance regimes, and issue ACCUs, NZUs, and California ARB credits. So governments need to come and regulate the demand side of that. Don't mess with the supply side. I think the standards and methodologies are developing quite nicely, but regulate demand. So make sure that those heavy emitters are held accountable, either through offsetting or climate change mitigation hierarchy. So, eliminate, reduce, and offset the last mile. And so increased reporting standards and transparency is the first step of that. The UNFCCC with Article 6 has a big say in all of that, but governments have to come and say, for you emitters, we are now going to cap you or tax you. And that will create the market, because that then regulates underlying demand. Singapore's a great example. They've got a $25 carbon tax. It's a hybrid system where they allow foreign credits or voluntary credits into that, up to 5% of the mitigation effort. And so that underpins the demand. And so with that, we understand now we can invest in projects because we know that that demand is at a certain value. And so that price transparency and the ability to monetize carbon is certainly something that investors want to see for long-term investment decisions that we make.
Yeah, Singapore really seems to be going for it, right? It's a strategic play for the state to be active, creating this carbon tax, seeing people invest into projects which generate credits.
But also helping, adjacent countries and the rest of Asia, because they're accepting offsets or credits from other parts of Asia. So Singapore's always been quite forward-looking, and I live here. But I think that that's a great example. And what you're seeing now is Indonesia, for instance, in their market, they're accepting the international standards. So SRN previously they wanted to develop their own methodologies, but they also understand that as a net sink country, they can actually export credits, and it's a financial return for them. They can tax it, and it's just like exporting oil or exporting minerals or exporting resources. And they see that as a way to help them not only reach their NDCs or nationally determined contributions, but also an export market where they can get some revenue for the country. So it's good for both.
Well, one of our regular podcast guests, Stuart Clenahan, he coined the term nature-based carbon capture and storage as a new industry.
Yes.
And I think that seems to be what's happening in Indonesia. People have realised this is a major new potential source of income for us, because if people want to buy these credits, we've got this massive extent of land that we can either conserve, reforest, peat re-wetting is a major
we have
activity.
A project in Thailand that's done that. 74,000 hectares of wetland restoration. Yeah. And so, when you talk about the global north, with climate finance into the global south, the carbon markets are supposed to be partly of that, is that mechanism to be able to effect that. And that's what you're seeing with private sector investment into the global south for countries to develop their carbon markets, not just as a revenue-raising tool, but also for their NDCs under their Paris targets.
Brilliant. Well, that's fantastic. Been really, really enthused. It was great to hear about some of the fantastic work that you're doing. I'm sure you will see an orangutan at some point.
I'm hoping
in your West Kalimantan concession. Any last messages that you would like to give out? I think it was very, very clear to me that the missing piece of the puzzle at the moment that you said, or the single biggest thing, would be government action. Anything else that we haven't covered that you would like to?
Yeah, look, I think in terms of forestry and sustainable forestry, there's a flight to quality now. And if you're a corporate out there trying to figure out what you want to do for your 2030 and 2050 net zero obligations, it's to get in there and start to invest into the nature-based space. It's the most proven way of sequestering carbon. And I'm talking about nature-based, but I'm specifically carbon because that's the only market we have available to us. And what we're finding with a lot of corporates now is if you're a large corporate with a lot of requirement for procurement of carbon credits, the traditional way it's been done is that you have this small sustainability team that's inundated with 1,000,000 different, 100 different projects trying to figure out whether these are high integrity or not. So that flight to quality, what we've found is New Forest has now become a proxy for that, because they only do one diligence on us as a manager, and it's our job then to help them to procure. So we become a proxy for quality. And that's certainly what we're finding with the investors now into our funds. They're relying on us to do that, but it also helps us then to be able to scale, because ultimately we don't want to do this for $100 million or even $8 billion. We wanted this as $100 billion and $8 trillion, hopefully. But in order to scale, you need to be able to. We need corporates and institutional investors to not only develop the asset class, but also to invest with the good guys and the people that say they're going to do what they say they're going to do. And there are no shortcuts to this. And so we've been around since 2005. We've made a lot of mistakes. We're applying that now, those mistakes and lessons learned, to our new investments. And we hope that, we always say we want to be the best experience for not just our investors, but also our communities and partners on the ground.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Geoffrey,
Thank you.
for your time. I think that was a fascinating conversation and a great window into the great work that you're doing. But I should release you to go and do that great work. And look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you for having me, Murray.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you.